The fields and lanes around the sleepy village of Bullecourt in northern France became Australia's cauldron in the battles of Arras here in April and May of 1917. We follow not just the ANZACs here, but men from the West Riding of Yorkshire, and examine the story of the bravest man in the AIF.
We're on the battlefield southeast of Arras this week, near to the village of Bullecourt, and we're back in ground connected to that film 1917. But this week's podcast is not about that film, and we will touch on the history of the Hindenburg Line. But much of this week's content is about the men of the Australian Imperial Force, the AIF, or often called the ANZACs. The ANZACs have occupied a big chunk of my interest in the Great War over many, many years. One summer, almost 30 years ago, I sat in the garden and read most of C.W. Bean's official histories of the Australians on the Western Front. Now, I guess there are not many official histories which you could say you've read from cover to cover, but Bean's engaging narrative and the way that he personalises the stories with the names and details of individual men is what really brings that whole history of the Australian divisions and the units that fought in the AIF to life. And I found myself on my travels across the Western Front dipping and diving into locations well off the beaten track in those days, from Fromelles to Bullecourt, which we'll look at this week, but on the high ground of the Hindenburg Line in the final battles of the war, around the tracks of Mouquet Farm, and up in Flanders around Polygon Wood and along the Messines Ridge. And then in those early years of when I lived on the Somme at Courcelette, the mayor of my village was Monsieur Gons, whose grandfather had once owned Mouquet Farm. In fact, the family still did own it. It was still rented out to the same family that had had it nearly a century before, the Van den Drischers. And in honour of his grandfather and the connection of that farm to the Australians, every year Monsieur Gons, the mayor, would host a visit from the Australian War Memorial, a group, a battlefield tour, that would come and visit the village, and he'd lay on a Van d'Honneur for them. And Monsieur Gons asked if I would act as his translator and lay on a little exhibition of Great War artefacts for the group to see. The first time they came, they had a guide who would always be their guide, Peter Burness, who was a senior curator at the museum with a lifelong interest in Australian military history and the author himself of several books. Peter then used to come and stay with us at Courcelette in the week before the tour began, and we'd tramp off to obscure Australian battlefields and look for some forgotten locations that he'd found in war diaries or photographs or memoirs. One time he came with some friends and they had some amazing panoramic photographs that had been taken by an Australian photographer on the battlefields just after the war. And his friend turned up with a nappy bucket with these things rolled up inside. And off we went with some trench maps to go and find the locations where they'd been photographed. And he'd brought with him a special camera to take some then and now images, which led to an exhibition at the Australian War Memorial at that time. But living on the Somme, this moment in time in the 90s was when there was an explosion of interest in Australia's part in the Great War beyond Gallipoli. Gallipoli had defined its experience in the war, but then Australians suddenly realised that 45,000 Australians had died on the Western Front. This was the bulk of their wartime service, and they began to come back to the Western Front, or perhaps visit the Western Front for the first time, to see where a relative had fought, to visit a grave. And there were very few organised tours for them outside those done by the Australian War Memorial. And often they would just arrive in drips and drabs, and you'd bump into them. One summer we encountered a young Australian lad at Albert Station looking at the map of the Circuit de Souvenir, which is the tourist route that takes you around the Somme battlefields. And he had a slouch hat on, and there could only be one nationality there with that. So I tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Good day, mate." And he came and stayed with us for a few days, young Ian. He'd been following his grandfather from Gallipoli and then out to the Western Front. And he showed me some of the diaries that he'd written during the course of his journey. This is, in many respects, still the pre-digital age. He wasn't writing this on an iPad. or taking digital notes. He was writing it just like his grandfather had probably done in a paper diary, and reading some of his impressions of watching the sun rise over the Aegean Sea off of Anzac, or what it was like to travel along the railways into France. It was probably just like reading the thoughts of the men of the Australian Imperial Force who'd come that way during the Great War. And I found myself as well in the 90s and into the early 2000s being involved with the Australian government's attempt to look to build a visitor centre and open new memorial sites, the one at Lahamel, for example. I assisted Brigadier O'Brien with that and had some fascinating times with him, a Vietnam veteran, on the battlefields, comparing how forward observation officers in the Great War did their task compared to him in the jungles of Vietnam. So this interest in the Australians and watching Australian battlefield tourism develop over that period, what was in some respects an obscure interest turned into something that became mainstream, and more importantly, what it also meant is that the men of the AIF, the ANZACs, were not forgotten. And 2 decades later, although COVID has obviously got in the way in more recent times, that level of Australian visitors to the Western Front continues. They come just like the men who came before them from the other side of the world, not to fight now, but to remember and to visit the graves of those men who laid down their lives for Australia, for a new nation, a new Dominion nation that was rising and finding its way in the world. Now, that's not to say there's not been a bit of what has recently been called ANZACery on the battlefields of the Great War. With all these Australian memorial sites, there is perhaps this feeling that somehow their story dominates. And I've had a few friendly conversations with Australians about the role of their men and how that fits into the wider picture of the British Expeditionary Force of which they were a part. And we know now that not all Australians were 6-foot bronzed bushmen. The majority of Australians lived in towns and cities at the time of the Great War, for example, not in the bush. But the AIF was an all-volunteer army from beginning to end. There was never any conscription. It fought in some of the toughest battles of the Great War, and its men, being part of a nation that was finding its way in the world, perhaps felt differently about themselves, and the characters that you see emerge from its story are really quite incredible. So all of that brings us to these battlefields near Bullecourt, a battlefield that cost the Australian Imperial Force dear in 1917, and we're now going to take a walk across that battlefield, not looking just at the ANZACs, but looking at the story of the men who fought here around Bullecourt in 1917. We're starting the walk close to the village of Choisy, a village captured in the advance to the Hindenburg Line in 1917 before the Battle of Arras began. The Germans, having completed the construction of the Hindenburg Line during that winter of 1916-17, realising that they could not hold the Somme front indefinitely, withdrew to it, and the British Army effectively followed up behind. And British units captured this village in early April, and it became essentially the position from which we established our outpost line, lightly dug, shallow trenches initially, similar to the ones that we see in the film 1917. I promise I won't keep going on about that. But those trenches give us an idea of what the positions here at that time looked like. With these positions established, that gave us a foothold to fight the next battle, and that battle in this area would be the Battle of Arras in April and May of 1917. But we're not starting in the village of Choisy, we're on the outskirts of it, down a rural track leading up to quite a steep embankment, which was the old railway line that ran from Arras through these villages across towards Cambrai, a railway line that was decommissioned many decades ago and is now a cycle and footpath. But we're not on that, we're on a minor road that runs parallel to it and leads up to a small battlefield cemetery, Choisy Railway Cemetery. It's quite a remote cemetery, this one, way off the beaten track, and I suspect doesn't get a large number of visitors. And it's so named, of course, because it's set right at the foot of the embankment where the railway line once ran. It's one of a number of cemeteries connected to railways, which we're going to look at in a future podcast, the connection between the location of cemeteries and the naming of cemeteries, and that link to the vital logistics mechanism that was the railways. But this ground captured in early April of 1917, the cemetery was started by the 21st Battalion of the Manchester Regiment, which was originally a Manchester POWs battalion. It had seen action extensively on the Somme in 1916, and many of its original POWs had been killed or wounded. Some by this stage of the conflict had returned to the battalion, but increasingly their ranks were now being filled not by volunteers who joined up late, but by this stage, of course, conscripts. Conscription had come in May of 1916, nearly a year before, and now many battalions on the Western Front, like the 21st Manchesters, originally volunteers, POWs, the bulk of their ranks were now made up by conscripts to replace those losses. They buried some of their dead in the cemetery, and then the cemetery was used by frontline battalions and units in this area from April 1917 during the battles here in the Battle of Arras right through to January of 1918. On the 21st of March 1918, the Germans broke through in this particular area. Ernst Junger, the famous German soldier author of the Great War, with his two fantastic memoirs of that conflict, Storm of Steel and Cops 125, he took part in the fighting in this area and describes it in Storm of Steel. But the Germans buried some of their dead from this action in existing cemeteries. So the several British cemeteries that existed at that time in this village and in the neighbouring villages were all used to bury their dead. And in some cases, those soldiers were subsequently removed for burial into German cemeteries post-war. In other places like here, their graves remain. So it's only a small cemetery, and we've got 181 British burials at Croisy Railway Cemetery, 26 German. There are 27 unnamed soldiers and one special memorial. The unnamed are quite likely men from that March 1918 period, possibly buried by the Germans. The Germans, just like us when we captured a position, would bury the enemy's dead. Both sides did this for practical reasons aside from anything else. But so these men are probably from that period of the war, and the special memorial may well be a grave that was destroyed in shell fire during that March 1918 German offensive that swept through here. The ground was retaken subsequently in August of 1918, but there are no burials from that period in this cemetery. Other cemeteries in the area were used at that time. When we look at the plot of British graves that are in here, they reflect very well the types of units that passed through this area during the fighting against the Hindenburg Line, particularly in 1917. And when we read the cemetery, when we look at the cap badges and look at the orders of battles of the divisions of the British Army, we can see a connection between the different units that passed through here. The 7th Division and those men from the Manchester POWs, for example, men from the 62nd West Riding Division, Yorkshire Territorials, and later on men from the 16th Irish Division. They took over this sector after the Battle of Arras was over. They'd come down from the fighting along the Messines Ridge and along the Steenbeck River in August of 1917, when men from the Irish Division had taken very heavy casualties in those operations, and they came down to what was a quiet sector, but found themselves in November of that year being involved in a diversionary attack for the Battle of Cambrai, which took place over to the right flank, off in the distance towards Cambrai beyond Bullecourt. But the 16th Irish Division took part in a small-scale assault against the German positions here to draw German attention away from that area of the battlefield. The infantry went into action against the German positions with a large number of men from the Royal Engineer units of the division, including men from the 156th Field Company. And I mention this because one of the men who was killed in that assault and is buried here is Sapper James Quantrill. He's my great-uncle, one of several great-uncles who fell in the war that connect me to different parts of the old front line. He was a South London boy, and his brother and his dad were in the army. His father was a regular soldier in the Royal Engineers, and he was at the front. His brother was a reservist in the Royal Fusiliers, and he came out in 1915 and served in the fighting around Ypres and then on the Somme and at Arras in 1917. And I like to think that the brothers may have met up at that particular point, as they were very, very close together indeed in 1917. But also I know that Jimmy Quantrill spent a big chunk of his war up in Flanders, and being an engineer, not always in the front line, operating the area behind the lines around Ypres back towards Popperinge. And when you go into Talbot House at Popperinge, you go in through the original front door and into the main corridor there. There are some frames on the left-hand wall that contain some of the Friends notice board announcements that were pinned up on the walls of Talbot House at that time. And what would happen is that when men were in the area for a given amount of time, they would put their details up on the wall there to announce that they were there, and any friends or family that saw that could seek them out. And although Jimmy Quantrill's name is not up there, it's an incomplete collection of these notices. There are quite a few men from his unit, from 156th Field Company, and I often wonder whether he was in there with them. And every time I've been to Talbot House, I've thought of him and wondered, did he climb the stairs too, just like I've done many times to the Hoploft Chapel. So here's one of my own personal beacons to the Great War buried in this cemetery. And I feel lucky that I'm the custodian of his medals, his Great War medals. My Aunt Ivy gave them to me many, many years ago because there was no one within her family who was really that interested in the story of the Quantrills. Quantrill was her maiden name, and she wanted to make sure that he was not forgotten. And I've walked the track from Quasi up to this isolated cemetery on many occasions to come and see him, and here he is, buried amongst men of his units, men of his division, and the British and Australian soldiers buried side by side, close to the graves of their foe, the Germans, in this perfect English garden of remembrance, here, out in the fields, along the lanes, somehow cut off from the modern world, but which transports us back to the generation of the Great War. And once more, a cemetery like this is the sepulchre of the memory of the men who came this way over a century ago. So we'll bid farewell to the lads here, and towards the back of the cemetery, underneath the railway embankment, there is a tunnel, and it's been a while since I've been through there, but you could actually access the other side of the embankment by going through this tunnel. I would guess that it is probably a post-war reconstruction of a tunnel that was there at the time. And looking at some of the trench maps, it seems that we probably used tunnelling companies to put additional tunnels through there to facilitate movement from the safety of the cover of this embankment through it and towards the frontline positions that were indeed beyond. So we'll take that tunnel. That'll take us out onto the Quasi-Écoust Road, and we'll turn left there, walk up the hill slightly, and a track will go off to the right signpost for Bullecourt, and we'll follow that track as it rises up onto high ground again, and here we'll stop as we've reached the battlefields of the Hindenburg Line. We're standing now in the open fields between the villages of Quasi and Bullecourt, on what was essentially the left flank, the left-hand portion of the battlefield at Bullecourt in 1917. And in the two major attacks here during that battle in April and May, the 62nd West Riding Division were prominent in the fighting in this area of the battlefield. They were a Yorkshire territorial division, 20,000 men with 12 infantry battalions, a pioneer battalion, and all the usual supports from engineers to artillery to Army Service Corps to Royal Army Medical Corps to Veterinary Corps. They had been formed in 1914 because the local territorial battalions of the West Riding of Yorkshire were already full with either their pre-war members or the men who'd flocked to join at the beginning of the conflict. So what were called second-line territorial battalions were then formed. So in Barnsley, where I live, there was the 1st 5th Battalion of the York and Lancaster Regiment that recruited in Barnsley, through Elsica, where I am, across towards Rotherham. In 1914, their ranks were full. They went off to fight with the 49th West Riding Division. So they formed a second-line territorial battalion, the 2nd 5th York and Lancs, that were recruited in exactly the same area. So in many respects, they were a duplicate battalion of the original one, recruiting men from Barnsley across towards Rotherham and on the fringes of Sheffield. And that battalion fought alongside its sister battalion, the 2nd 4th York and Lancs, the Hallamshire Battalion, and were part of this wider West Riding Division that included men not just from the York and Lancs, but men from the West Riding Regiment, the Duke of Wellington's, for example, but also the West Yorkshire Regiment and the King's Own Yorkshire Line Infantry. So it was very much a Yorkshire division. Now, we've come across these lads before because later on in 1917 they fought at Havrincourt, and we visited their divisional memorial in the walk that we did from Havrincourt and the ground around Flesquières. So you can go back through the podcast to find that episode in the list. The Battle of Arras began on the 9th of April 1917, but the assault in this area didn't take place until the 10th. On the 10th of April, 4 battalions of the West Yorkshire Regiment attacked the ground close to where we're standing now from outpost trenches, so from lightly constructed shallow trenches that formed an outpost line rather than a proper defensive line, because they didn't need to defend it. They were about to attack and move the Germans back, and they moved into the assault on the Hindenburg Line, these deep trenches with thick belts of wire, machine gun positions, often machine gun bunkers, concreted infantry shelters and tunnels. This position that the Germans felt was almost impregnable. And indeed, on the 10th of April, it proved to be so, because despite a bombardment that on the Somme the previous year would have been more than sufficient to dislodge the Germans, here this wasn't the case, and the thick belts of wire remained uncut, and the West Yorkshire lads got mown down by German machine gun fire and shell fire and had to pull back with heavy losses. No unit that day under these circumstances was going to breach these positions. The second and much bigger attack took place across this ground on the 3rd of May 1917, one of the deadliest days of the Battle of Arras, when the assaulting battalions went into action supported with tanks. For the men of the West Riding Division, this was their first experience of the use of tanks alongside them in the Great War. Not very successful at all. And it wasn't just the Australians, which we'll discuss later on, with their poor experience with tanks, that gave soldiers little confidence in the ability and indeed in the use of tanks. What was their purpose, apart from being shell magnets? It happened here as well, and it wasn't really until that final year of the war, when the use of tanks was properly perfected, that the infantry could see what an advantage it was to have tanks on your side in operations like this. In this attack, the bombardment did much more damage to the German positions and, more importantly, the wire, so a lot of battalions got through and into the German trenches. Some on the right got into the village of Bullecourt itself, some even got beyond Bullecourt, but those men were so few in number that they were isolated by the Germans and surrounded and either killed or taken prisoner. The losses here in that attack on the 3rd of May 1917 to the men of the West Riding Division were very heavy indeed. There was over 3,000 casualties. And when we look at it, the effects of those losses on what was essentially a locally raised unit. So this wasn't a POWs battalion, it was a territorial battalion, but it was recruited in the same way. So places like Barnsley, where I live now, they were affected here in April 1917, nearly a year after the first day of the Somme, when the death of so many Barnsley POWs at Serres had devastated the town. Barnsley and its outlying villages were affected once more by the losses here at Bullecourt. In the 2nd 5th Battalion, they had well over 100 soldiers killed in action, with quite a high proportion of those from the Barnsley area. And when I look at the Barnsley War Memorials and the outlying villages, including my own, I see men killed in this attack. Lance Corporal Charlie Kirby, for example, who lived in Foundry Lane in Elsica, down in the main village, he was one of those who was killed. So this loss of men and how it impacted a community didn't just end with the Somme. We saw many occasions again throughout the war, particularly in 1917, in actions like this at Bullecourt, and the involvement of men from Lancashire, for example, at Passchendaele, which we discussed in a previous podcast, in the assault there as late as October 1917. So the echoes of the effect of raising a localised battalion went on way beyond the fields of Picardy. In one of the West Riding Division's machine gun companies here at Bullecourt at that time was Lieutenant Henry Williamson. Henry Williamson, author who went on to write the best-selling Tarka the Otter, but later in his life wrote A Chronicle of Ancient Sunlights, which is a 15-novel sequence following one London family from the Victorian period to the time just after the Second World War, when the main character, Philip Madison, sits down to write this epic account of Britain in the early part of the 20th century. Williamson based much of these 15 novels on his own life and his own experiences, And the volume that covers the ground here at Bullecourt is Love and the Loveless, and I'll put a link to this on the Old Frontline website, oldfrontline.co.uk. I bought a copy of this book many, many years ago in a car boot sale, and it was a copy owned by a veteran of the Great War, in which he'd sent it to another veteran, and he'd said in the introduction, he'd written on the flyleaf of the book, that this was one of his favourite books of the war, and that the author couldn't possibly have been in all these places, which was indeed true, but that it gave such incredible descriptions of the fighting. Williamson was here as a transport officer. He had his donkeys, his mules, and he brought them up to the area here around Bullecourt to bring up the ammunition and supplies to the machine gun companies who were supporting the infantry in the assault here. This ground was Williamson's last battle on the Western Fronts. He got dysentery in the summer of 1917 and went home and never served overseas again, but he spent the rest of his life in the shadow of the Great War and in the shadow of the comrades that he left behind here on the battlefields of the Western Front. And his work, for me, remains some of the finest writing about the Great War ever put in print. So with thoughts of Williamson and his donks bringing up the supplies and the ammunition under shell fire, we'll follow this track down and into the village of Bullecourt. It comes down into one of the main streets, and there's a museum up on the left-hand side, and that will be our next stop. Today, this is the museum of Jean and Denise Lettay. Jean Lettay was the former mayor of Bullecourt. He was a local farmer here, and Denise was his wife. And for many, many decades, they did so much for the thousands of Australian visitors who came through here. Young Aussie backpackers would turn up in Bullecourt expecting there to be a hotel where they could stay, but of course it was a tiny village and there was only a bar. So Jean and his wife would often put up these young Australians and look after them and feed them and take them to places. It was a wonderful thing that they did over so many years, and it was great for me to see in the 1990s them being recognised for the work that they'd done, the kindness that they'd shown by Australia with the award of the Australian Order of Merit. I first met Jean way back in the early 1990s when on one of these trips following where the Australians had fought on the battlefields. I read in John Laffin's excellent single-volume guidebook to the Australians that there was a little private museum in the town hall at Bullecourt. So we came here, and like on many trips to the battlefields, often there were these strange coincidences in which you were just in the right place at the right time. And I came here, and the Mairie, the town hall, was open, and in there was a tall figure, the mayor, Monsieur Jean Lettay, and he very much welcomed us in. He showed us his exhibition of artefacts that had been found on the battlefields and personal things that had been brought over by families in Australia who had left them behind, photographs and other artefacts. And he said, I'm actually closing this soon because I'm going to build an extension in my own farm. I'm about to retire from farming, and I'm going to use the farm buildings for the museum. And not long afterwards, he did indeed open this fantastic museum, private museum of the First World War, in his own house, in one area of his barns that he converted for the best stuff, and then in one of his bigger barns he had the larger objects, which included quite a few chunks of tanks. Some of these tanks that had been used at Bullecourt in 1917 that had been found by local farmers or had been unearthed when they'd been doing work in some of the fields. So this was one of many such private collections that existed on the battlefields at this time. And you could go from area to area and come across these local collectors that would have these amazing time capsules of the Great War, where the artefacts that they'd found from their locality really did tell the story of what had happened there during the First World War. And when I lived on the Somme, and we used to have Australian visitors and come across to see the battlefields at Bullecourt with them, we'd always call in to see Jean. And for a while we used to do small group tours with Leisure Holidays in a smaller coach, and we used to call in here quite regularly to see his museum. People were just amazed at the sort of artefacts and objects that he had in here. And he spoke pidgin English, and he would always try and converse with them, but he was such a kind man. Him and his wife always would welcome you with a cup of coffee and a bit of cake and a chat, and it was just a great experience to come here. And so sadly, as time marches on and people like this fade away, what happens to museums like this? And thankfully here, Jean thought ahead and the collection was donated in perpetuity and is now run by the local council of this area of the Pas-de-Calais, and they turned it into a formalised museum in part of the barns of his old farm. The house has been sold and someone else lives there now, but the barns are here with a new museum, and there's video of Jean and Denise and film showing the collection laid out as it once was. And I think what they've done here is a very sympathetic way, a homage to Jean and his ideals. Not every object that he had in his personal collection is now on display here, but it does help tell a story and is a museum really worth coming to, and I can't recommend it enough. And it's good to see, really, that someone like him can live on in this way. In the previous podcast, we spoke about how Jackie Platou of the Last Post Association had sadly died. And these men and women who form part of the character of the battlefields as they have been over the last decades, part of what many of us describe as the old guard, when they begin to fade away, we can lose so much. But here at Bullecourt, it hasn't been lost. Jean and Denise live on, and the stories of the men that they tried to perpetuate the memory of, they're here too, and it's very strong on that. It's very strong on individual stories of ordinary men, and not just ANZACs, not just Australians, because this was a battlefield that involved men from many different units, and that was reflected in the things that Jean found in the fields around Bullecourt. I'll put some pictures of the old museum up on the podcast website so you can see what it once looked like, but looking at those and going there today, you'll not be disappointed, and I hope that the next time you're at Arras you will have a chance to visit this excellent small museum. So from here we'll continue along the roads up to the next crossroads. We'll turn left there and we'll walk up to the church. The village of Bullecourt was completely destroyed by the end of the Great War. In the first 2 years of it, it was pretty much untouched because this was a village way behind the German lines when the front lines were in the Somme region, and units that were fighting there would often come back to villages like Bullecourt and be billeted here in the same way that we utilise villages behind the British front line beyond Albert towards Amiens for exactly the same purposes. So the presence of the German army here was a visible presence to the locals. But then at the end of 1916, as that cold winter of the war approached, the Germans arrived to construct the Hindenburg Line, to build this system of defences to withdraw into once it was complete. And they brought with them not only their own pioneers and engineers to do this, they brought a large number of Russian prisoners of war to do a lot of the donkey work, but they also conscripted local villagers to come out and do some of the work as well. And eventually, once this work was nearing completion, places like Bullecourt, being now close to the frontline area, were evacuated and the people thrown out of their houses and sent off to become displaced persons, most of them going off towards villages or locations up towards Lille or over towards Cambrai, some up into the occupied parts of Belgium, many of them never to return. When the war ended and people came back to the dust of this village destroyed after 2 years of almost constant bombardments in that second part of the war, very many families just never bothered to come back. It's a similar tale right across this area of northern and eastern France. So everything we see here, including the church we're standing in front of now, is completely rebuilt. Nothing predates the First World War. But in front of the church there are a number of memorials, including quite a large one, the original Bullecourt Memorial, which is often referred to as the Slouch Hat Memorial. It's a brick and stone structure with Portland stone, Commonwealth War Graves Commission style engraved panels on it, and then a bronze slouch hat, the hat worn by Australian soldiers, topping the memorial on the upper level of it. And it commemorates not just the Australians. The Australians participated in a major way, as we'll discover in the fighting here in 1917, but the memorial came about in the 1980s with the cooperation of the village of Bullecourt, Jean Leté, and also a gentleman in Arras called André Quaillot, who again had one of these amazing private museums, had written a number of books on both the First and the Second World War in French, and in that period of the 80s tried to sort of kickstart some of the remembrance of what had taken place here
by putting up memorials on different parts of the battlefield, and this was one of them. So it commemorates the Australians, but it's also got the divisional emblems, the divisional signs of the British divisions, like the 7th Division, the West Riding Division, and the 58th London Division, all of whom fought on this part of the battlefield. John Laffin, who wrote an incredible number of books on military history, in what I think was one of his best books, which is the single-volume guidebook that I mentioned to the Australian battlefields, and we'll put a link to that on the podcast website. He says in that this bronze slouch hat was an original slouch hat that was bronze. Now, I don't quite know how you do that, how you bronze a piece of felt material. Maybe somebody in response to this podcast can tell me, but I suspect it's just a copy of an original slouch hat. And for many years this was the only memorial on this battlefield, but others in various shapes and forms were added, and we'll come to the main Australian one further into this walk. But then sometime in the late 80s, early 90s, they found a big section of tank track out in the fields, and they brought it here to place near to the Slouch Hat Memorial, which was a sort of impromptu memorial to the role of the tanks. And then eventually that was formalised into a proper little memorial that commemorates the men of the tanks who were here in 1917. So you'll see that when you come here today. So this little square in front of the town hall, which once housed the original Jean Latte Museum, is directly opposite the church. There's a little cafe on the corner which is occasionally open. These places in rural France now that have cafes are getting rarer and rarer, sadly. And from here we'll continue up through the village, out onto the battlefields. We'll get to a fork in the road, and we'll take the right-hand fork that goes towards the village of Bullecourt, and we'll walk down into a sunken part of it where we'll come to the memorial park. This memorial park was one of a number of sites that was established by the Australian government in the 1990s that began to help drive that return of Australians to the battlefields. They'd never come in any great numbers, even in the interwar period. There was no big Australian pilgrimage to the Western Front in the same way that Canada came to Vimy in 1936. But Australian visitors had come to visit sites and pay their respects to the fallen. But in the 90s it began to change, and the Australian government spent a lot of Australian dollars on creating sites like this on different parts of the Western Front. And this statue that's here, this bronze statue of an Australian soldier, the Digger Memorial, was designed by Peter Corlett, and it was unveiled on Anzac Day 1992, the 25th of April. It depicts Peter Corlett's own father, who was a veteran of the Great War. It's based on wartime photographs of him, and it commemorates the more than 10,000 Australian soldiers who became casualties at Bullecourt in 1917. It gives us a good impression of what an Australian soldier at that time of the war looked like, what he wore. He's got his slouch hat on, and when you look at the photographs of Australian soldiers, they did march to and from the battlefields, often still wearing their slouch hats. When you read the accounts of some of the Australian soldiers, some wore them in the front line, but of course one of the reasons you wore a shrapnel helmet, a steel helmet, was to protect your head from shell bursts above the trenches. So any right-minded soldier would always have his steel helmet on when they were available. And of course by the time the Australians came to the Western Front, they were pretty much de rigueur for any soldier in the forward zone of the battlefield. But the Aussies liked their individuality, and the slouch hat was their symbol, so it's quite appropriate, I suppose, that this bronze digger has got his slouch hat on, but his helmet's on there as well, and he's wearing his battle gear, his 1908 pattern webbing. A lot of Australians, when they came to the Western Front in 1916, there'd been a shortfall in production of webbing for Australian soldiers, so they were wearing a leather copy of the 08 pattern webbing equipment that was made, it was set out of kangaroo hide. Whether that was entirely true or not, I don't really know, but certainly its survivability in the ground is pretty good. Jean Latte found examples of that leather equipment here at Bullecourt, and Dominique Zanardi at Pozières on the Somme has found a whole load of it at different times over the years in the fields around Pozières where the Australians were fighting in 1916, and it comes out of the ground looking pretty much almost new. And I found bits of it myself walking the fields there and along the Elbow and around Mouquet Farm. You can't help but come across this stuff. So he's wearing his combat equipment, he's carrying his Lee Enfield rifle that all Australian soldiers had, just like British Tommies, and he's got his gas mask on his chest, his small box respirator that was used in the latter period of the war and the standard issue to troops by the time they got to battlefields like Bullecourt in 1917. So when you come here with groups, you can tell the wider story of the Australians in the fighting here during the Battle of Bullecourt, but it also gives you a good opportunity to talk about what soldiers wore on the front, in the front line in 1917. Also here by the entrance to the site is what's called a Bastian plaque, and these were designed by an Australian dentist, Dr. Ross Bastian, and they were put up on the battlefields, I think from the late 80s into the early 90s, on different sites where the Australians had fought. It was an unofficial project, and many people thought that they'd been placed there by the Australian War Memorial. And in one or two of them, there's some slight inaccuracies about some of the history, and the Australian War Memorial used to get complaints about these things, but of course it wasn't their work. But what Dr. Bastian did really was, again, it helped kick-start this interest and this identification of the importance of Australian battlefields on the Western Front. So it's all part of that process that led to the resurgence of Australian interest in coming to visit places like this. But at the back of the memorial site in November 1994, one of the local farmers was going about his usual business doing some ploughing, and he unearthed the body of an Australian soldier. It was obviously skeletal remains, but with him was his equipment and his rifle and his helmet, and more importantly, his aluminium identity disc, his dog tag. The Australians had quite a thick aluminium one that many soldiers wore. They had the red and green fibre ones as well, but a lot of Australians had these aluminium ones, and of course they survive in the ground, and this one was in very good condition, and from that you could read his details. The tag identified him as Sergeant Jack White of the 22nd Battalion Australian Imperial Forces, who had died on this spot on the 3rd of May 1917 in the Second Battle of Bullecourt. He was a blacksmith from a town in Victoria in Australia who had joined up at the beginning of the war and had seen extensive service on the Western Front. As the body was carefully removed from the ground for handing over to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, a small leather wallet was found in what was probably the position of his tunic pocket. And when it was opened up, inside was still visible a faded image, a very, very faded image of a soldier with his wife, 2 young children in the front, and a young baby. And as that wallet was gently and carefully removed from the soil of the battlefields of Bullecourt, and that photograph was suddenly visible again, incredibly, that young baby, Myrrell, was still alive, now an old lady living in Australia. Finally, her father had been found. The Australian government contacted Myrrell, and they came out, the whole family came out. It had been a tradition within the family to name the oldest son Jack in memory of Sergeant Jack White, who had been killed here in 1917, and the eldest surviving Jack White came for the eventual reburial of Sergeant White in Quillon Road Cemetery, a big military cemetery not far away from the battlefields of Bullecourt, that took place on a misty day in October 1995. Finally, her daughter had some closure. She'd found her father, and his loss and her grief somehow spoke for the wider loss of Australians here on this deadly battlefield of 1917. Some of the artefacts that were found with Jack White were given to Jean Leté for his museum, and they are still on display in the museum in the village today. So in many ways, quite rightly, a part of Jack White remains forever here at Bullecourt. While the discovery of soldiers from the Great War has become quite commonplace over recent decades, the finding of Jack Whites in this field at Bullecourt in 1994 was the first time since 1978 that an Australian soldier had been found on the Western Front and identified, and it shows how much that whole process of the recovery and identification of the dead has moved on since then. From the Digger Memorial we'll return to the sunken lane and we'll turn right and continue downwards, and a little bit further along where it becomes sunken even more, on the left-hand side on the bank, is a memorial, an older memorial than the Digger statue. This is a grey stone structure with a cross on the top that was placed here in the 1980s as in effect another early Bullecourt memorial, but this one prompted by British military historian Tony Spagnoli, who wrote quite a number of books on the Great War and had a special interest in Australia's role in it, and also by his friend John Laffin, the Australian military historian that we spoke about a few times. And the memorial was here to commemorate the missing of Bullecourt, the vast majority of men who had been killed in the fields around Bullecourt, whether that was the West Riding Division men killed on the left flank. Their names were on the Arras memorial to the missing. The vast majority of the soldiers who died there do not have a known grave. And the same was true here in the battlefields around Bullecourt, where the men of the Australian divisions had fought. So old Spag and Laffin, they came up with the idea of this memorial, and Jean Lattey, of course, in Bullecourt was heavily involved in it, and this was put up here to commemorate those missing soldiers. Over 2,400 Australian soldiers were missing at Bullecourt. And what began to happen as Australian families began to visit these battlefields, they wanted to leave something behind. With a missing soldier, there was a name to see on the Villers-Bretonneux memorial, but there was no grave. So people began to fix plaques to the side of this memorial structure, and you'll see those there today. And I think in that early time frame, when the first Australian visitors began to come to places like this, before the Digger Memorial and before the creation of memorial parks, this was an important focus for their remembrance. Whether it was for a missing soldier or not, this was where they came to pause and think. Looking out across these open, wide open fields, there are no military cemeteries here, no obvious place for a pilgrim to visit, but this was somewhere where you could stand and you could think of that face that had come from the other side of the world to fight here in 1917. So just like the Museum of Jean Lattey, the memorial here lives on as a legacy to Tony Spagnoli and John Laffin. And although Laffin's views on generalship in the First World War and the conduct of the conflict are very much out of vogue now, I have a bit of a soft spot for him, really, in that he continued to try and popularise interests in military history, and in particular the Australians in the Great War, at a time when few other people were doing that. So from here we'll continue along the road to a point in which we'll meet a number of tracks coming in from different directions, and that'll be our next stop. Where we're standing now is a position known on the battlefields as 6 Crossroads, and the track going off ahead of us down towards the right-hand side of the village of Bullecourt is what was called Central Road. 6 Crossroads isn't quite 6 Crossroads anymore, but it's still identifiable as that junction on the battlefields. And where we are is right in the heart of the Hindenburg Line defences here. The two main sections of the Hindenburg Line that ran through here were called by the Australians OG1 and OG2. They were Old German Lines 1 and Old German Lines 2, which were the names given to the German positions around the Pozieres windmill on the Somme in 1916, and they just replicated those names for the German positions here. Where we're standing on this point on the battlefield, we are not just in the heart of the Hindenburg Line defences. In many ways, we're in the heart of the cauldron that was the battlefield of Bullecourt in 1917. This was the great killing ground of April and May of that year. The first Australian assault on these positions was on the 10th of April, and the second one went in on the 11th in what was the first Battle of Bullecourt. This was a very, very cold period of the war. The weather itself was challenging, let alone the enemy, and the Australian soldiers went into action that day in the snow. And for the first time in Australian military history, these Australian battalions were going into action supported by tanks. 3 of the key battalions involved in that assault on the 11th of April were the 14th, the 16th and the 48th battalions. The 14th was Jacka's mob. That was the battalion in which Albert Jacka VC was serving. He was the first Australian to be awarded the Victoria Cross at Gallipoli in 1915, and he'd gained this incredible reputation as a fighting soldier. At Pozieres in 1916, he fought in action in which many felt that he should have been awarded a bar to his Victoria Cross, but that never happened. And his battalion, the 14th, was forever associated with him and became known as Jacka's mob, which for them was a huge source of pride. Lieutenant Rule, who wrote one of the histories of the 14th Battalion, records in that they would march along the lanes to or from the battlefield, and another battalion would go by and see the colour flash on their tunics, indicating they were 14th Battalion men, and would whisper under their breaths, "There goes Jacka's mob." And he says that it sent shivers almost down their spine to be associated with a soldier like Jacka. The 48th Battalion was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Ray Lean, and this was a battalion in which a number of members of the Lean family served. Its nickname amongst the diggers was the Joan of Arc Battalion. Why the Joan of Arc? Well, the Joan of Arc was the Maid of Orleans, and the 48th Battalion, because of all these members of the Lean family in it, was Maid of all Leans. So it's one of these great Aussie jokes. Sadly, in the fighting here at Bullecourt, this would cost the Lean family dear. Major Ben Lean would be killed in action, and Captain Alan Lean would die of wounds as a prisoner of war in German hands, his body never being recovered. And then close by, the 16th Battalion Australian Imperial Force was led into action by Major Percy Black, DSO DCM. Bean described him in those official histories that I mentioned as the bravest man in the AIF. He was a 39-year-old soldier and gold miner who'd been awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal as an ordinary soldier at the Battle of Gully Ridge at Gallipoli in 1915. Commissioned from the ranks, he became an officer and was awarded the Distinguished Service Order for the fighting around Mouquet Farm on the Somme in 1916. Leading his men into action at Bullecourt, he could see that the tanks had failed, so he repeatedly said, "Come on, boys, bugger the tanks." And under a hurricane fusillade of machine gun fire, he led his men through the wire. Having captured their first objective, in the advance on the second, Major Percy Black was always at the forefront of the advance, but was shot in the head and killed instantly. His body could not be recovered. The fighting continued, and when the ground finally was captured, his great friend Harry Murray, VC, went out to search for the body of Major Percy Black, but it could not be found. His name, like so many who died at Bullecourt serving with the Australian Imperial Force, is engraved on the panels of the Villers-Bretonneux Memorial on the Somme that commemorates the missing soldiers of the Australian forces who died in France from 1916 until the end of the war. There's a magnificent painting of Black leading his men into action at Bullecourt, which used to be on display, a copy of it used to be on display in the Mairie, the town hall in Bullecourt itself. I think it might still be there. If not, it's in the museum, the Jean Latte Museum. But this exceptional bravery that men like Percy Black exhibited on these battlefields that you read about time and time again in the stories of Australian soldiers in the Great War. Men like him, gold miners, come soldiers, risen from the ranks, decorated for their bravery. It's all part of that spirit of Australia, that Aussie spirit that you see running through the history and the stories of Australian soldiers on battlefields like these. With the failure of the first Battle of Bullecourt, the second one took place on the 3rd of May 1917, when at 3:45 in the morning Australian soldiers attacked in this area, and over to the left where we began, the men of the West Riding Division made their attack there. The barrage was much better in this attack, just like on the West Riding Division front, and the wire was cut. But heavy machine gun fire caused a lot of casualties to the Australian battalions that advanced here. And at one point a false order to retire resonated through the ranks of the shattered units that had made their attack here, and men began to pull back and the whole attack just fell apart. One of the lessons of the Australian engagement at Fromelles in 1916 was to never reinforce failure. Don't keep sending men forward when it's clear that the attack is ended, is finished, and it would only result in costly, pointless casualties. And Brigadier General Gellibrand, who was observing the attack from the nearby railway embankment, stopped further units from going forward and saved many lives, no doubt, that day. But despite that, this and the whole battlefields here at Bullecourt, this vast open plain beyond the village, was a massive killing ground for Australian soldiers in 1917. There were 10,000 Australian casualties here, killed, wounded and missing. And the vast majority of the dead, as we mentioned before, do not have a known grave. They're commemorated on the Villers-Bretonneux Memorial. Their bodies perhaps still out there, just like Jack White, but with another year or so and so many battles here around Bullecourt, this whole battlefield was almost atomised by shell fire, and perhaps any field greys were destroyed in the process. But this is a battlefield, like so many, that still keeps giving up its secrets. The last page, once more, is yet to be turned, if ever will be turned, on this battlefield. A few years ago there was an archaeological dig on this part of the Bullecourt sector where the tanks had gone in. 11 tanks from D Battalion had gone in to assist the Australians. One had broke down on the approach. Of the others that went in, 9 of them were knocked out and 2 rallied. The tanks completely failed here. On open ground, exposed, isolated, they were vulnerable, and those tanks and their crews paid the price. Tank 799, commanded by Lieutenant Davies, was one tank wreck that Jean Lattey had unearthed in the 1990s. But the archaeological dig that took place here more recently uncovered the remains of another, and the Germans photographed these tanks during the war quite extensively. They were, if you like, well-known wrecks on this part of the battlefield. So once more, despite the books that have been written about the Australians and the Great War, several books now on the fighting here at Bullecourt, we know so much, but yet there is still such a lot to uncover, so much to understand. And as we walk down Central Road out towards the railway embankment, the continuation of that old railway line that ran from the point where we started at Quasi Railway Cemetery, and we get to that embankment and look back across these fields around the village of Bullecourt, it is a battlefield forever associated with the Australians. But we've just crossed ground as well, where men from the 7th Division fought once the Australians had moved out. 2 veterans, Ron Short of the 2nd Queen's and Hugh Parry Morris of the Honourable Artillery Company, both fought here. I interviewed them in the 1980s. And Bullecourt was a battlefield that they were loath to discuss, except that as a killing ground it gave them an insight in what their fates would be at Passchendaele just a few months later in the swamps around the Ravbeek River, close to Zonnebeek. After them, the London Territorials of the 58th London Division fought here. And by the time the fighting at Bullecourt closed in 1917, with the Australians and the British losses combined, over 15,000 men had fallen in these fields here. It's a tiny area, really. 15,000 casualties, killed, wounded and missing. And when we stand here now, it's hard to imagine the shattered landscape that this once was. In the distance, the low hum of the wind farm. Above us, the skylarks which favour the vast open fields like these. Dust thrown up along one of the tracks indicates a tractor returning to work. In the village, the beep-beep of a car horn indicates the local bread delivery doing its rounds. Life has returned to Bullecourt, life has renewed. The world moves on, just as it should. But for those families that come from the other side of the world each year to stand here in wonder, looking for something that they probably can't really even quantify, for them there is a connection here that no words can really do justice to. Here they see where Australia took some of its first steps in a wider world. Here, amongst all this sacrifice, here was where the path of a Dominion nation was made. And while Australians may not visit every day, especially in the last year, Peter Corlett's bronze digger stands forever as a silent sentinel overlooking this part of the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.